kick-ass LiveOps need kick-ass tools. That's where Heroic Labs comes in. They just released a massive update to their Satori LiveOps platform. And having done my research, I can say with confidence that it's second to none. In a single product, you get everything you need, including event capture, player segmentation, feature flags, remote configuration, A/B testing, experimentation, live events calendar, messaging, retention grafing, analytics, and so much more. If you're serious about running live services in a game, get serious about the tools you use. Connect with Heroic Labs and make some serious cheese with your live ops.
Hey, my name is Adam Telfer. Today, I'd like to talk about PvE shooters. So what's interesting is back in the fall, back in October, we did a recording on PvP shooters. And now in retrospect, I feel like maybe we should have waited until, last weekend when all of these major releases came out. So we might need to follow up on that podcast. But I wanted to bring everybody back together again to talk about the PvE shooter space, which has been close to my heart, but also had a lot of interesting learnings through 2024. A lot of big releases, a lot of games coming out trying to go after more of that RPG combined with shooter mechanics. So today I've got a great panel of experts here. So let's do some quick intros. New to the podcast here. So Manu Rosier.
So I'm the director of market analysis at Newzoo. I started like 3 months ago, and my background is in publishing as I worked for almost 10 years for Electronic Arts before joining Newzoo.
Amazing. And back again, Chris Sides. How are you doing?
Hey, doing well. Yeah, just a quick recap. I've been in the industry for about 15 years, 9 years at EA, 4 years at Bungie. I was working on Marathon, director of product over there before I went to consulting. So I've been consulting now for about 4 or 5 months, and most of my experience is in mobile, AAA, and free-to-play and premium, a little bit of everything.
And Phil, who are you? Who is this guy?
Host of the #1 Game Economist podcast. I'm back. Position hasn't changed. Still #1.
#1 Game Econ. Okay, very specific. How many other Game Economist podcasts are there?
Look. I think it's a growing category. I get
We're talking about
sense.
the growing category, PvE shooters, growing category of Game Economist podcasts. Okay, but let's jump right into it. Let's take a look at the market. So let's give some context around the PvE space. How does it look like overall in terms of player base and revenue trends?
Yeah, absolutely. You showed this slide last time where it was more of a focus on PvP. I would say the curves are a bit deceiving because if you look on the left, you have the feeling that the PvE is rather flat in terms of engagement. But actually, if you zoom in and you look in terms of percentage rather than absolute numbers, the trend has been similar. The only difference is probably that this space is more dependent on the new releases. So you have spikes caused by new releases, but most of them usually fade away quite quickly. I think this is probably something like one big game in this space can make a huge difference in terms of the total market engagement. And we saw that with recent releases.
And so what were the recent releases in the last 12 months?
So we had Helldivers 2, and there was the last Descendant.
First Descendant, yeah.
First Descendant, not last first.
First Descendant.
Maybe it will be last soon. But
How dare you? I love that game.
Throwing
Wow.
shade right from the beginning.
Put the guns away.
Yeah, no, I think these were the two. One's human, and I have some thought about that one because I could play it in the last days. We will also see in the next slide, there is some cannibalization is within this segment when these big releases are being released.
And besides MAU trend, which seems like it's very similar to PvP, but we're seeing those spikes from releases, what does downloads and revenue look like in this space?
It's pretty similar. I mean, some of these games, like Helldivers 2, is more of a premium type of game where the release is mostly happening at launch. I mean, there is some live service and some extra content monetization afterwards, but most of the revenue was made there. And for the other titles, this is something I would have to dive into deeper to understand what's the revenue curve over there. But usually, if you're talking about a free-to-play game, the revenue curve will follow the engagement curve. Right? The more player you have playing, the more revenue you generate. And also, you would have spike whenever there is a new season or a new event. In the same way that if you look at Destiny, for example, when you see the spike in engagement for Destinies when they released their last piece of content, and this is also where you would see more revenue incoming. So I would say these are rather related. And And acquisition, so installs are really also totally linked to the hype of a game, right? You have a lot of installs at the beginning and then it stops very quickly.
There was just two other things that I think were worth sprinkling in. Like I looked into Helldivers 2 numbers recently. Remember, that was released in February of 2024, so this year. And I saw estimates around $500 million, a little bit less than $500 million, which I thought was an interesting data point just to get a temperature check on like, okay, top of the market, premium entry price, got some DLC, got some MTX. How accurate is that? Take it with a grain of salt, with everything. And the other thing that was shared on the podcast a while back, way back when, by Eric Kress, was some very interesting numbers about Destiny and like what that revenue split was in terms of DLC versus cosmetic MTX, with DLC taking a really large share of revenue. Again, rumor from Eric, so I don't know about that, but I thought those were
rumors.
Interesting numbers.
Yeah, rumors.
Rumors. And so I thought that was interesting temperature checks on this space, just in terms of straight revenue. Like it feels like premium is still pretty popular of a model for these type of games. Even when I think of like deep, fantastic game, it feels like there's some, I guess I'm just curious about the premium free to play split. If there's anything we can say about that. You got the first Descendant. Is there any changes in how we should think about these two models for the space?
I think Destiny is the proof that like content drop are still working very well to engage your player and also to generate revenue. I think these games are mostly driven by that. And Destiny is called a free to play, but the reality is almost like gated content because you always need to have the last expansion to really enjoy the totality of the game. Beside that, we don't have sign that the first Descendant is making a big splash, but let's not forget that we also usually focus on PC and console in this analysis. I can't say at this point that one formula is working better than the other. I think it's more about the quality of your game and what you bring in the game to keep it relevant, because Helldivers 2 was great at launch, then had kind of a dip of engagement and also a dip of content because they were not ready to bring additional content. I think the key in all these games is keep content coming, right? You need constantly to get interest from the players.
Just like an interesting trend that I noticed between this and like the PvP stuff we talked about last time is that these older games are still the dominant factors. Like Destiny is still the dominant here. And all of these games are trying to enter. Some of them spike. I'm actually surprised to see Back 4 Blood have these spikes there. I mean, I remember playing it when it launched, but it did feel like it died pretty quickly. I imagine if Warframe was on here, it would probably follow a similar trend of Destiny. I don't think it'd be as high as Destiny, but it would be kind of this just kind of straight line across the graph. And so I think it's, again, interesting, the parallels. And if we talk about like live services being hard in PvP, it's impossible in PvE. Like the content requirements are just so much different than in PvP titles. And I think that's why we see a lot of these entrants coming in. Back 4 Blood, I think, was premium as well. I can't remember now.
It was. So I don't know if you know this, Chris, but I actually worked on Back 4 Blood.
Yeah. Oh, you did?
Oh.
I knew.
Try not to throw
Brian...
so much shade at it, okay?
Well, look, I played it for, a day. I couldn't get the right cards to get the game correct.
Yeah.
But I mean, you see these games jump in and then leave. Again, I think premium is the answer to that. Like Once Human and First Descendant are both free to play, which definitely increases their install base. But I don't know, it feels just too scary. Free to play is too scary, especially in PvE. Good Lord.
In the case of like zooming in on Helldivers, right? We're saying, hey, maybe it made $500 million this year. Obviously an amazing launch outcome for a very small team. But what do you do as Helldivers right now? Like you've got this amazing audience, but like, is the model here like, hey, let's go and build some enduring active player base? Or actually is it just, let's crank out an amazing expansion every year and just make up that revenue that way?
I mean, my perspective is like, do Helldivers 3. Like abandon Helldivers 2, like live services, getting those players back is going to be insane. Like essentially make Helldivers 3 as like a win back for Helldivers 2 in a weird way. Like, because in live services, it's just so insanely difficult to either get the players back, to maintain the player base when new entries are coming in. Especially 2025 is going to be crazy with the games that are launching. Like I don't know, that's my perspective.
I would agree with that, but let's avoid the Left 4 Dead 2 situation where the next one is coming way too quickly, maybe, and player feels like some content has been held from the previous one just to release the next one. Another thing I want to highlight in the list of title, and I was personally a bit surprised, is that the Division 2 is actually quite healthy in this one. And the Division 2 is the game that suffered the most from the launch of Once Human. And it's kind of logical because these are games, it's at the border between survival games and shooters. Like you are in a vast open world with other players, so you try to survive. And having played Once Human is very similar to The Division, with the difference that you have some base building and even more survival elements compared to The Division 2. But other than that, Helldivers is not an open world PvE game, right? And some other games are not neither. So I think the element, is it session-based in a non-open world, or is it more of a survival shooter open world? I think make it also different in this segment.
But pushing on that, like if you were Helldivers right now and you look at the example of like Division 2, I don't think it would be stuff announced to Division 3 yet. I would hope that they're working on it, but they've got this long period of time before building up that sequel. And they seem like they were surprised by the success of Division 2's tail and the fact that they could even add an extra year of live content after that New York expansion, right? Like I think it was like 2 years after the New York expansion, they were all of a sudden surprised that, hey, maybe we could actually run a little live service here. So in the case of Helldivers, like, do you really just say, take all resources, move to Helldivers 3, abandon the current active player base in Helldivers 2? Or do you find a way to like bridge up small expansions in some way so that you can keep your active player base and then pull them over to that next one?
Why not both?
I was thinking
throw
it
money
too.
at it.
It's just a question.
Throw money at
Yeah.
the thing.
Yeah, I would definitely think there's a world where Helldivers 2 is supported for X time while Helldivers 3 is worked on. But like I guess that's like the strategy standpoint. But from the actual like, you know, physics of doing that with like Sony and the studio, and like I don't know if they were prepared for the success it had, and I'm sure there's different pressure from Sony now than there was before. Like to do that is extremely complicated, extremely challenging to split up the dev team that way, to build it from nothing. Like the amount of money you're going to pour into that and how long it's going to take and how much your estimates are going to be way wrong when you're trying to look at release timing. I just don't know like if the physics of that support the business.
If you're Sony though, and you've seen the risks of live service that they've had, right? Like this feels like a bird in hand versus two in the bush type of situation, right? Where you could lean into an existing player base, a game you know that's popped off. And I know the MAU is relatively low as we see from this chart, but that doesn't speak to all these lapsed players that obviously still had an amazing time with Helldivers. And as we've seen in other PvE games on this chart, like you can still create big spikes long after the launch if you create those big re-engagement moments with expansions with enough novelty, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I totally agree. I think that it kind of, its long term kind of suffers from what made it so good in the short term. Like the kind of like crazy moments that occurred, the heavy social aspect, a lot of like clippable moments that happened in live streaming really is what, in my opinion, like supported that launch in probably the first month or so. And that's what led to its success. But from a long-term tail perspective, it doesn't seem like that type of experience actually lasts. It gets a little bit repetitive. You know, those moments that are like crazy the first time, the whole like, you know, what's Starship Trooper feeling just doesn't last. And so like its success that made it short-term is actually harming its long-term, in my opinion. And I mean, you can do this within Helldivers 2 as well via an expansion, but I just don't think it has the marketability of Helldivers 3. But it does also work. Like it's practice for Sony.
There's no winner though. Like there's no one who's there's no one has won the market. No one at all.
This is mainly looking at it from a MAU perspective, right?
I think Destiny 2 is the one.
And Warframe. I think Warframe.
Yeah, and Warframe.
Yeah.
But this is kind of the question, right? Like when Helldivers came out, I remember there's a lot of narratives being shared around saying, hey, this has been a dormant space. Look at Helldivers. It's broken into this. Finally, someone's able to like crack this nut. Like everybody's going after extraction shooters. Everybody's going after PvP games. But this has been a blue ocean that's been like waiting. But then you look at each one of these releases and you say like from at least a active player base perspective, no one's been able to create a strong tail like Warframe and Destiny has. So what's the right takeaway here?
There are a lot of PvE gameplay in some other games that are not really labeled and as PvE, right? I think even in Fortnite, yeah, you're in the battle royale mode, but somewhere you're within a team. I think there are other games out there where they have this PvE element, and they might be substitute to just games that are only PvE and where you can't play any other experience. I think what's kind of ironic is Untitled saw a spike in engagement recently because they introduced a PvP mode. Maybe something that would help Helldivers too would be to have a PvP mode. Who knows, to get engagement or to increase their audience. There's another game that I didn't pick up. It's a Remnant from the Ashes. Also a game that I could have a look at.
I think with Remnant, it just had that spike from launch and then with Game Pass, but it also had very similar engagement curves.
I think the thing about Hunt Showdown is like it did introduce a PvP mode, but in reality, it was just like a big marketing moment. I think that really brought players back. Going back to like the how do we fix this tail problem, I think there's like a little bit of an existential crisis of like, do tails exist anymore? Like, is that actually a strategy to have a tail in today's market? And I think I may have said this last time in the PvP one, but I do think there's a world where even Helldivers, you know, let's say it has a low DAU or low MAU, like it can still support a decent business just from like, if you just focus on like your core audience, they spend well, like you can still have like a really good business there, but it's not going to be a Destiny, right? And I think that the strategy of like, how do we become this high MAU long tail game? I don't even know if there's a strategy that gets you there. I think there's steps you can take that increase your odds, but I don't know if tails are really the thing to do anymore versus launch premium and, you know, get your money quick up front, at least some sort of guaranteed to pay back the dev cost and potentially be profitable, and then repeat that process. I just don't know if tails are really here to stay anymore.
The one counterexample I could show, because I think you're completely on the right track here, is Deep Grok Galactic has actually grown over time in terms of concurrent users. But that's really the only one I could identify that's had like this crazy growth. I mean, Left 4 Dead really isn't around anymore. They don't pump content. I mean, maybe Destiny, but I mean, that's a very, there's a lot of curves to that chart. It's a voluptuous chart.
Yeah.
So it's grim. And I hear you on building PvE modes into other games, but if the strategy here has really been from premium, it feels weird, for instance, to put big zombies a plank of Call of Duty. And when I've seen these spinoffs, if you remember Rainbow Six Siege had a PvE FPS spinoff, like quickly forgotten, felt like a good idea. It feels expensive to fit it into another game. It doesn't feel like it survives on its own. It just feels like a challenging market. Like I feel like you got to dump the thing and get out of here, as we're saying, right? I don't even think you do DLC when I look at this chart, you know? Like I think you got to go to game number 3 or sell it up front. DLC passes. That's the only other thing I think is worth. You sell it up front at the point of sale.
The other thing is when we judge the success of a game, maybe they are like there is another side of the coin. It's like they had such a massive unexpected success and hype that it makes you feel that the situation right now is bad. But actually, it might not be that bad. It just be because you compare to something that happened. And I feel like the audience is ready very quickly to jump on whatever is new and shiny and get bored very quickly. But ultimately, the people that are left are in some case higher than the expectation from the developers.
On the business side, like for sure. But I mean, before launching the game, if they were like, oh, we're going to make $500 million, that would be like the craziest thing ever. But once you're in live service and in it and you knew what you once were, that number is irrelevant. Like it is all relative to like the day to day. Like that is painful, even though you can look back and be like, oh, we made all this money, you know? So when you're actually living it, it is brutal. And companies aren't going to look at it that way either. No exec is going to be like, oh, but you overperformed here. Like that's really, it's like, no, it's always what is now, how do you make it better? How do you go to what it used to be? And I think that stress is like a hidden layer to game development that we don't really talk about that has like an impact on the tail of these titles, especially ones that are going to be backed by a publisher or some large company. $500 million is fantastic. Like on the outside, that sounds great, and it is great. But when you're in it, it's like very painful because it's relative to where you were. From a like team morale standpoint, it almost feels like moving to a new, like to a Helldivers 3 or something is like healthier for the people working on the game than trying to maintain what once was of Helldivers. So a little bit less of like a strategy side and more of just like as you're developing and like the feelings at those times.
Don't the individual DLCs have good revenue tails? Like, aren't you building a library of monetizable content as you build this library? Is there anything to be said for that?
I mean, like, yeah, like the stackable kind of DLCs that come in. I mean, I do know that, the backlog of Destiny, I believe, did pretty well. I don't remember the actual numbers and everything, but for sure, you do get this like backlog and this tailing revenue. But I think it is heavily reliant on the MAU of the day, not of what it was. It definitely does help, and there's a tail. I just don't know how substantial it is.
It goes back to like the Paradox model, right? Like Paradox Grand Strategy on Steam type of thing, where they've done some great GDC talks where they talk about their strategy of how they try to maintain engagement in order to sell the paid DLCs and the cadence of free DLC versus paid DLC to keep enough players so that then when they launch those paid DLCs going through. And actually a lot of the games in the fighting game space do a lot of this as well, where I think you could still have a pretty viable small DLC business in Helldivers 2, laddering up to that Helldivers 3, because I think there's also a benefit of having an active Helldivers 2 player base that you're then upselling and giving, like pulling them towards Helldivers 3, which can work. But then again, like as Sony too, Helldivers 3, do you go for the moon or do you say, hey, maybe Helldivers 2 was kind of an outlier. We should aim for the normal area, like the median of the market, rather than assume another crazy unit seller that they've seen.
This is only 90 days after launch, right? This is also very quick to see any kind of turnaround when you would invert the trend. And we've probably, I think, working on Apex, I remember that there was a big splash, but then there is always a cooldown period. But then if you give time to the developers, maybe 6 months or 9 months after, they can come back, bring some new content, re-engage the audience, acquire new audience, and then find new high in terms of engagement. So I think it's clearly Helldivers to the team might not have had a clear live service plan before launch. And they see the success and then now they have more resource to work on that. But maybe it needs a few months at least to come with more meaningful content than what they've produced so far.
And I definitely think that they were probably surprised by their success. I mean, it feels very much not at the scale, but similar story to like Apex. They were Respawn was not prepared for their live services. Granted, they had 50 million installs in February, and so like even if they lost half or 60 or 70%, they saw a pretty healthy business there. As we're talking like releasing these little DLCs, the competition right now is insane. It's just every month there's something crazy. So like even if Helldivers 2 releases a good DLC, it's like it's going to be competing with like some new monster that's releasing into the market. I know everybody's scared of GTA 6 next year, right? And so like all these publishers are trying to figure out how they're going to release this title or whatever titles they're working on. But I think that feeling about GTA 6 actually is occurring every month within the industry. We just don't really see it that way because it's not a GTA 6, but it is some big title like Wukong, right? Like no one was afraid of that game launching, and then it releases and like it's killing it. And that has some impact on Helldivers 2 to some extent. Even though they're not the same genre, I do believe that like the player bases as gamers are starting just to like intertwine into multiple markets.
It also feels like in the market that the offering of content is growing faster than the actual population of player. And because time is incompressible, there's only so many times per day, multiplied by so many players. But the offering, the number of live service game that you can play right now, it's, 10 times, 20 times more than maybe a few years ago, while the audience has not grown at that level. So at some point, players have to make choices and they don't have space for new experience.
So when we look at like the PvE space here, do you think that it's actually more susceptible? Like in my mind, I'm thinking typically PvE games demand higher hours played per player per week, right? Like PvP games, you actually don't need to play as many hours. PvE games take over your life and are typically, like you can see it from the engagement numbers, quite high. And then on top of it, to Chris's point, you have a higher overlap to major premium releases. Like I'm assuming the release of Wukong, right? The release of Space Marine 2 had a higher impact on the PvE service space than it does on Fortnite. That's it.
Yeah.
Hypothesis, but I'm assuming like this space actually becomes more susceptible to those black hole moments whenever you get a big major release.
Yeah, there is probably more overlap audience because the PvE audience is more looking for a non-competitive, less competitive experience, which is similar experience that you find in single player games. So yeah, that I can see an overlap there in terms of what players are looking in the game they're playing.
Yeah. So we're pretty bearish on the PvE shooter space. I'll take it.
Another positive DOF podcast.
I'm bearish on the market. So
Bearish on
don't,
Yes.
I'm not
So-
targeting PvE shooters.
The next Helldivers-like moment in PvE, or the next PAL World-like moment,
Pal World, yeah.
we should all be bearish on the tail, right? Like, yes, they can get the units, but bearish on the tail.
I mean, Marvel Rivals right now, like that's what some of my thoughts looking at it. I mean, that's not PvE, but
yeah. Again, we got to do that PvP thing
I
again
know,
now.
bring it back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think just a small comment about Marvel Rivals. If that game doesn't succeed in really staying in the market and having kind of this long tail, I'm just wondering what PvP can achieve that, because it has like a lot of qualities. And if they are not successful with the polished experience that they are offering, I would be very worried as a developer of a AAA PvP game.
So we are in a full pessimistic death spiral right now.
This podcast is brought to you by AppsFlyer. In today's digital world, understanding your app's journey from discovery to download is more than just insightful, it's essential. Enter AppsFlyer, the leader in mobile attribution and marketing analytics that allows you to measure the full potential of your marketing efforts, making every ad dollar work smarter. With AppsFlyer, that's your new reality. Dive deep into data-driven insights that reveal exactly where your users come from and how they'll interact with your app. AppsFlyer, where your app's potential meets performance.
Step into the future of game monetization with Xsolla, the premier partner for game developers seeking to expand their reach and revenue. Xsolla provides a robust suite of tools designed to enhance user acquisition, manage subscriptions, and streamline payment solutions worldwide. Unlock new markets and maximize profitability through their customized, secure payment architecture and dedicated support team. Xsolla, powering game developers to achieve global success.
But let's move forward to looking at First Descendant and Once Human, because we've talked a lot about Helldivers. We talked a lot about the existing live services, but the two big bets this year in free-to-play were First Descendant and Once Human. Chris, you had some time to play through First Descendant. Why do you think it ultimately didn't retain?
Yeah, so just for some context, I have 120, 130 hours in the final Descendant. I've loved it. And I was a big Warframe player, obviously played a lot of Destiny. I love the grind aspect of these titles. And it's Nexon, I played a lot of Korean MMOs, so I'm a little bit biased here. But I do think that from a system standpoint, economy standpoint, and a gameplay standpoint, it had a lot of really strong offerings. And I think it is something that competed with Warframe that Warframe hasn't really seen in a long time. And I do think that it cannibalized some of their audience early on. However, the tail is showing that it's doing okay, but I don't think it's going to be like the next Warframe, for example, to have this 10-year lifespan. And I think that a lot of this comes down to the Elder Loop. I think that its initial offering, there's so much to do and things are you're progressing very fast. You're doing really well. It feels really good. But then when you get to the Elder game, there's nothing like the raids of Destiny or the dungeons of Destiny. Those kind of peak things that you're working towards. Right now in the final Descendant, you're essentially working towards optimization of stuff you can already do. And so there's no really working towards this next thing. They did add some 400% damage, they're mini strikes from Destiny. And so they are attempting to do some stuff there. But I do think that the long-term tail is because of just the Elder Loop. I think something that Destiny does very well is the Elder Loop. I mean, that, 99% of that game is the Elder Loop. While I think that First Descendant just hasn't really solved that area yet. And I don't know if it's too late for them or not, but I'm not sure. And I think in general, it's a pretty core game that it shouldn't really install that well, in my opinion. I think it installed pretty well, but it is a very core title. So you imagine retention is going to be pretty weak, but the players that are playing it are going to be diehards, which I was for many months.
So it just did not nail endgame loop, didn't nail aspirational content.
That's truly my thought, is that in Elder Loop is just not there to sustain the tail. There's just nothing on the scale of raids and dungeons in Destiny. I'm trying to think of another PvE shooter that does it well. I mean, Warframe pivoted to story at one point with the War Within quest chain and stuff. While the First Descendant has story, but God, it sucks. And it doesn't have any Elder story either. So that audience doesn't care, in my opinion.
The other thing I'm curious about is like, why can't we lift systems off of any RPG? Like, what are considerations we need to take because it's a shooter specifically? Like, is there anything that we should confine kind of like our game design analysis or any of our numbers to the shooting aspect? Does that change any of this?
I don't think it actually changes the systems themselves. I think there's a change on like power creep and power progression whenever you're doing these things. And so I think from a progression standpoint, yes, but a system standpoint, I mean, I think there's so much stuff in the RPG space that is just not utilized in many other spaces. I think there's so much opportunity to take these systems and economies and these deep and like, ritual loops that a lot of these RPG PvE shooters have and put it into other areas. I mean, this is what Extraction is trying to do. It's trying to introduce these RPG elements for good reason, in my opinion. But yeah, I wish that we would take a lot more of these RPG elements and just like push them into other games in unique ways. Like don't just slap it on top, like figure out how it fits in the game. But I think there's a lot of opportunity.
So what is like Helldivers 2 doing wrong from like a systems perspective? Because when we look at this chart, Helldivers 2 is supposed to be the big one, and it is in terms of revenue. But this is a linear decline, basically, since it reached its peak only a week or two after launch, and it's still declining. Like we don't even know where the bottom is for all these games. Like these graphs have not stabilized except for Warhammer 40K Darktide, and it was at 10% of its launch base. And again, different models, this isn't measure sex, all the things we've been saying, but like, how do you lift that tail from a systems and economy perspective?
If you're asking why Helldivers didn't do it, like Helldivers didn't have the systems, right? Like it had a very linear progression system of unlocking stratagems, which as soon as you've collected the most relevant ones, it's done, right? And they've even struggled to add more to that progression track. But in the end, even like just a linear system of like collect enough coins to get the thing that I want, level up enough so that I can actually purchase the thing is not an engaging system for progression. Like I think there was a false positive here in Helldivers. If you look at this curve, they got that huge bump at the beginning and it looks like, pretty decent retention in that first few months. But the reality is like, it just went viral and everyone was playing it. And then the more of your friends that are playing it, the more inflated your retention is. But then as soon as that bubble starts to burst, you're just going to see like this thing actually just doesn't have deep RPG systems. Like you compare this to Path of Exile and you've got two ends of the spectrum.
So is that what First Descendant should have done? Should they put in a Path of Exile star system?
I think their systems themselves are like, no, I don't think their systems are really a problem. When I worked on Galaxy of Heroes, we always talked about like create a hole and fill the hole. And so you create a hole and then you have players fill it in some way. And I just don't think that, and like a hole, I mean like Destiny, like, oh, the raid is a hole. And then players need to fill that. You need to like introduce systems that give them different weapons or skills or whatever to beat this raid. And I just don't think that there's a lot of holes that are created in both Helldivers and in Final Descendant. And so there's nothing to fill for players. Once you fill the hole once, it's like, okay, well, the hole's full. Like, what do I do now? There's not enough holes being created, in my opinion, for the Elder retention side. And then, I mean, Helldivers, yeah, it popped off. It was viral. A lot of friends played it together. But as soon as that one friend says, like, hey, I kind of want to play Fortnite tonight instead of Helldivers, like, it's over. And I think that's kind of what hit it.
Is it meta collection? Is that the whole? It's like creating ways. It's creating demand. It's stretching roster demand like a squad RPG. Hey, I need the light character. I need the dark character. Just reinterpreted for PvE shooters. Is that how I should think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's like the breadth and depth from the economy standpoint. And I think that First Descendant has really good breadth. But from a utility standpoint, it's very shallow. Like there's like 3 Descendants that you can max out and just 100% the game. But there are 20 Descendants for you to work on. And so like the breadth is there, but the actual utility side and using them is really low. And so you kind of finish these things. I think the key thing is like, you never want to feel done. And I think that First Descendant and Helldivers both suffer from like feeling done. I think Destiny does a pretty good job of not feeling done. I think the question with Destiny is more like, well, do I want to keep doing this stuff compared to like it being done?
And on your question of like breadth and like giving meaning with shooters, the one thing is like the second to second combat is not the same as a card battler or a isometric dungeon battler or an action RPG, where the second to second gun feel, if you're not able to have sort of low TTK enemies, like having the mob that you're shooting through, that you're able to get those headshots, you start to feel like you're shooting math in the stone, which is what Anthem felt like at launch with just a ton of these sort of bullet sponges.
And so there's certain things around the design of shooters that you still need to keep that second to second, as well as like how your movement feels and what your weapons are doing. So the one interesting bit is like, if you're designing a weapon in one of these shooters and you're trying to figure out what's the right traits and like what are the right build starting points, where on something like Diablo, the fun thing is when you create a build that has chains of like, hey, I do this thing, then this thing, then this thing, and then I get a huge payoff after doing that. In shooters, that can feel like shit. Like that can feel terrible of like trying to shoot that thing in the head, then move the thing over. So you actually have a more limited design space in how some of those items can actually be designed. Otherwise, it starts to feel like way more complicated than I think a lot of shooters need. That's why I think Destiny actually gets away with fairly simple and thin weapon design, where it doesn't drastically change how you play second to second. But then when I watched something like Division 2, where they tried to go kind of crazy in their end game in terms of the design of weapons. I remember one where you had to like paint enemies multiple times and then eventually come back around and you would do higher damage to it, right? And you're like, I'm no longer playing a game anymore. Like, this is not fun. This is not a thing. So those are elements you have to watch out for shooters versus action RPGs.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because First Descendant has a very similar thing with its weapons, with its like legendary weapons. There's ones where it's like you shoot totems that like expand as you shoot them. And if an enemy is inside the totem, it takes damage over time, like for sure. I mean, Destiny does have some kind of crazy ass exotics, but for the most part, the second to second is the feel of the weapon plus whatever your abilities and movement you're doing, for sure.
Did you use the totem weapon? Was the totem weapon your favorite weapon?
No, it's not my favorite. I did it just to get like my master rank up, but
yeah.
So what about Warframe? What are they doing, Chris? I know you said you've been
They're
endgame
old.
Warframe. They're old, but they're sustainers. We don't have the PSU chart here, but they've been sustaining or at least doing well for an extended period of time. What am I chasing? What's the system that's kept them alive as a smaller studio too?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I was talking to somebody who worked there before, and their kind of analysis at the time was like, I mean, Warframe is a very old title. It's over 10 years, I'm pretty sure. And like its growth trajectory was very similar to like Steam's growth trajectory. And so like in a way, they kind of grew with the Steam platform, which really supported that game for a while. And that's just from like an acquisition standpoint. But from a retention standpoint, I think one just massive, like it's just old. The old games are rising. Let's like look at the top titles. They're all like pre-2018. Like that's just how it is. The ones will come in and come out, but the ones that have the tails are old. And so I just think that there's a part of like these old titles that found this audience that they keep coming back because it's just like they remember it, you know, from 8 years ago or whatever. Again, I'm not a deep Warframe player. I played it maybe 50 or 60 hours like a couple years ago. And so I'm sure there's somebody who can actually give like a really good analysis of what's keeping players around. But I think a big part of it is it's old, honestly. Old player base. It's a great analysis, right? Just their old player base. You're welcome.
Yeah.
That's what I get.
Well, there
paid
was
the
like
big
a
bucks
mod
for.
system, right?
Mods, there's mods in First Descendant.
It is a very, very different engagement model than like a Destiny Once Human, and like First Descendant mold swords. But like I would call it the difference between like if Diablo and Destiny are pretty intertwined in terms of the way that they structure their systems, Warframe is actually closer to Galaxy of Heroes, closer to a collection RPG.
Sure.
And like they don't have gacha in the same way that mobile RPGs, but they still have very like it's a lot more about fewer assets that are highly valuable that you invest a ton into, in interoperability in terms of the mod system of you have a ton of theory crafting and now you're moving those mods around and making sure that you have a ton of depth in theory crafting so that you always have a reason to be upgrading every component of every mod.
Yeah, I mean the acquisition of Warframes is relatively simple, and the depth is in the investment, which was much like Galaxy of Heroes. Like we essentially gave characters out because we made 95% of our engagement and revenue on the gear. So it's like, here's a character, like go work on it. Warframe has a similar aspect to where like getting the Warframes is not that difficult, but yeah, the mod system, everything else is very complicated and very deep. I don't know what Warframe does to motivate players to continue to do this with their Warframes. Like that's the First Descendant's problem, is like there is no real motivator other than like pure intrinsic interest or something to play a certain Descendant, because you have the 3 meta ones that can do everything. So I don't actually know what Warframe is doing other than story. I don't really know.
looking at the engagement of Warframe, and it's been rather stable, at least since 2021. It has found its audience, and then the audience is still there, right? So it's not that much impacted by what's happening on the market. It's just a certain player really enjoy the gameplay loop, just playing actually the game. I think so. In some cases, it's enough, right? You don't always need to give something fresh or new. They just like the basic gameplay. And then I think there is an element when you play Warframe of feeling powerful, and that's probably this kind of emotions that some player really enjoy, and they want to play again and again, even if there's nothing really new.
So to break us out of this pessimistic death spiral, let's close this off in terms of similar to the PvP shooter space. Let's talk about like, what do we think it takes to be successful here? So if you were going after the PvE space, and I'm going to leave it open in terms of premium free to play, go after unit sales or going after active player base, but like, what do you think are the key things in order to get right, in order to break through and I see like at least sustain it at like the 2 million MAU level in today's market?
I don't know if my answer is going to be very much different from like any other kind of game that's trying to be a successful live service. But I mean, I think that social is very important. I think that Helldivers 2 kind of early success was heavily tied to social. I don't know if they planned that, but the game ended up having just like great clippable moments, a lot of really good times with friends, like very like Left 4 Dead-ish back when it was popping off and you were playing with your friends. The kind of fear of the social part is that there is a leader of those social groups, and when they play a different game, like that's it, and you have, as a developer, you have zero control over that. So like there's this like weird risk to it. But I do think having social elements is critical. Very deep systems, I think you have to have in PvE, because those players are going to burn through whatever content you release, a million times faster than you can release it. And so you need these very deep, long systems. And then you need a reason to engage in those deep systems. I think early on, deep systems are really fun because it's just checking boxes. Like you're just going forward. Like that feels really good for early retention. But then elder retention, you need the reason to actually invest in your character or whatever it may be. And I think a lot of games just struggle in that area. I mean, I love Destiny 2. Yes, I worked at Bungie, but even before, I just think that they've done such a good job with raids and dungeons and their seasonal missions and all this stuff. At this point, it feels a little stale and saturated, I understand. But when it was coming out, like that was revolutionary within the live service space. And I don't see a lot of games that have really copied that. I don't know why. So I think there is something there as well. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of just like taking my stab at it.
We sound pessimistic, but we're not pessimistic for the existing shooters, right? I mean, these are doing well. The ones that are well established, they are just doing well. And I don't think that's falsely a bad news neither for the market. I think personally, you need to come with something new, because if you're just going to do what other people are already doing, there's no reason for a player to switch to a new experience if this is the same mechanics. Innovation will really be key in there to look fresh. I think maybe looking at what the mods community is doing, what mods are popular. So many games have come out of the modding community, right? Maybe look at what experience in Fortnite are being successful and just build on that and create your own experience. That might be a way to success. Like see something that has been proven working, but that doesn't have yet the polishing that players are expecting.
You need a Travis Scott, Ariana Grande event.
Let's build upon that.
Yeah.
Build a live service of just concerts.
Exactly.
Well, were they Miles? Massive interactive live entertainment? That was a zero interest rate idea.
Was that like a LinkedIn-ism that somebody made up?
That was zero interest rate idea. It was wild times.
What do you think, Eder?
I reject the premise of the question that, you said like 2 million MAU. The market is what, 10, 15. So it's not that big. And 2 million MAU would be 20% of the market, maybe a little bit less, maybe 15, maybe even 10 at its lowest rate. Like there's no live service success here, really. I think there's a couple really rare examples. We didn't get to talk a lot about Payday. I think that's another interesting example. We talked about Warframe, which is sustained, but it feels like premium is the way to go. When you talk about PvE shooters, you should get your money up front. You should sell DLC pass, let it ride for 6 months, maybe a year to fulfill those promises, because I think the upsell is probably worth it in terms of marginal cost and marginal benefit. Maybe spin up a team to get Helldivers 3 going, just to concept stuff, kind of get a runaway going. And then maybe put a skeleton team to kind of see how long you can ride this PvE tail. Just as long as, remember, you just got to beat costs. Even if your TAM is shrinking because your MAU is going down, We talked about the fact that like just content drops can actually get some MAU up, which is nice. Like content drops in and of themselves can sustain a game. Destiny has done this, but like, can you do that with a smaller team? Even if you just kind of pound the rock, I think that's a very challenging ask. And I think, my poor little Sweden trying to keep this Helldivers going is not the right strategy for them. I think they should really think about splitting off headcount. But look, there's still money to be made. I don't want to brush over this. Like live service may not be the winning strategy here or, anything beyond a year. But like Helldivers is still going to pay the bills for this small Swedish studio for like the next 10 years. They made $500 million. And I think this game will probably clock out at 600 to 700 million, maybe do a couple remixes with some DLC, get my year one edition. That isn't too shabby. But if you're once human, if you're the first Descendant, I think you're looking at a pretty big L and maybe not a really big P. Those games could be real losses for the publishers.
And I think about like once human and trying to, now it's going over to mobile, right? Like now it's trying to have plans of going cross-platform, but you've got no basis right now on your PC audience. It's continuing to decline. So like how much longer do you have to polish that before you start to say like, maybe this should be more of a mobile first RPG and actually make sure that it can launch and retain and succeed in the mobile context, because it doesn't seem like it's got the foothold it needs, at least on PC. Like my quick sense here is, I think you have to break the model. I think in general, people have stuck to Diablo as the peak of engagement and taken a lot of systems from that. And actually Warframe is a great example of like, you don't need those systems in order to sustain. And I think the rubric, like the checklist of everything you need to get right is long, and it's longer in PvE than it is in PvP. So I think right now, like the only studios that can realistically go after this is an ex-MMO studio that understands like all of those layers that you have to get right. Like Chris, you're talking about like aspirational content. Like how do you build the right aspirational content? End game design. How do you make sure that everything I collect is actually valuable? And I've got enough activities that I'm cycling through to keep enough variety. You've got to be able to find that type of talent. And then I think you've got to break the model, which actually I look more towards other games like Payday, like GTA, which is also, not really just a PvP service. And you start to say like, there's other models here. Let's not just try to build the next sort of Diablo live service. Because even Diablo, right? Like Diablo has that same curve of like big spike, drop down.
In terms of pricing, it's not because a game is free to play that more people will automatically play it. Because I have some games installed on my computer that I've not even started because I know the engagement that's going to be required to play this game and to enjoy this game, even if they are free. So it's really more, the interest will drive the engagement more than the price. With maybe the limitation that really going full price, $70, I don't think a lot of game should go that way. But the mid price, like between $30 and $50, is probably good enough. And the positive is that it already brings a lot of cash to the developers, right? Upfront, instead of investing in the game, acquiring the audience for free and just monetizing it afterwards. I would also be advising to go like mid-premium type of business model.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I would totally say do mid-premium to full premium price. I feel like now premium is a marketing play. It's like, hey, we're not free to play. Yes. We're actually premium. Don't worry about it. Like, I don't know.
Phil is crying on the inside.
I would say the revolution is yet to arrive. It looks like it will not be televised or will be on Steam for PvE shooters.
Let's talk about it. This is just PvE. But okay, in terms of my takeaways here, PvE is a smaller segment, but it's declining at the same rate as PvP and is a far more susceptible, like far more spiky based on releases. And even compared to PvP, it's got even more focus towards older titles where really the Destiny, the Warframe is the only ones that have been able to sustain. So while I think everyone's been excited about Helldivers, it was very much a sort of spike and then drop type of model. Everyone was excited about Space Marine, also spike and drop model. So I think it was right for things like Saber to say, Space Marine 2 is a great premium game, get the units, walk away. Right call by Helldivers to become a premium game and launch the way that they did. Maybe we can argue about some residual business between these things, but the right call is to start saying, what's that next sequel? What's that next big spike you can create? And when we looked at things like recent free-to-play games, the amount of things you got to get right is very long. And for something like First Descendant, it didn't get the aspirational content, it didn't get the end game. Might have got a lot of other things right, but unfortunately, just by not hitting those 2 bullets, you've got a pretty dire DAU curve there.
Sell it. Sell the PvE game. I would say sell it to a small team. Like do the Stumble Guy strategy. Like see if someone can breathe some life into this. Like we've seen a little bit more of this in mobile, but like the PvE games like Deep Rock Galactic and Payday, and like even the Paradox stuff, it's all made by like crusty Swedes who are like just live in darkness and are like appealing to this really small market. Like Deep Rock Galactic is made by like Danes, like just crusty Danes. So I would say like they go after something weird, sell it to someone, see what they can do with it. I wish we sold more games to see if someone else can breathe life into them. I think you have very little to lose.
Like give this to Deca. They've got this. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So let someone else take a shot at it. I think there's still some life to that you can breathe into some of these old titles.
I just had one thing, just thinking, what about asymmetrical PvP? There was some success in the past, but it's kind of a dormant genre right now. Like, for example, I remember playing so many hours of Left 4 Dead human versus zombies. Right? It was amazing. And I think we don't have that in Back 4 Blood, for example. Everybody has been burned by Evolve. And what happened with Evolve is kill the genre. I'm just wondering if this is not something to bring back, because there is a part of the audience that has never played these kind of games. I'm just wondering.
Dead by Daylight and Friday the 13th. They've done pretty well with a very similar Evolve. I know. I remember I was so stoked for Evolve. RIP, man. Dead on launch. But yeah, there's definitely some games I think that are doing that pretty well.
Okay, let's close it at that. Thanks for your time, everyone.
And we'll talk soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
You did it. You made it to the end of the episode. As a fan of the show, it would help us out if you'd subscribe and leave us a review on the podcast service of your choice. Those stars and likes, while a small action on your part, mean a lot to us and help to grow the show. More importantly, are you a member of the Deconstructor of Fun Slack group? If you have 5 years or more of games industry experience, go to deconstructoroffun.com/Slack and apply to join. Join the games industry best professional community filled with peers always willing to lend a hand, or subscribe to our newsletter to get all the latest insights from the Deconstructor of Fun content creators. Thanks for listening.